I'm the Executive Director of Sixth Street Community Center, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this great collaboration with the Municipal Art Society. Sixth Street Community Center has a long history, and I'll be interested to hear what the speakers can contribute to that historical look back. The building was constructed in 1900, obviously, as a synagogue. It became abandoned sometime in the mid-70s, and people on the block took over the building and were able to repurpose it as a community center with the support of the congregation, who had mostly left the neighborhood, but were very helpful in making us happen here now. So that's really fantastic. A lot of people say it's a very calming place. I hope you're feeling that. I think with 85 or more years of prayer, plus about another 30 years of yoga and other meditative arts, it's brought a lot of calm to the space. But in addition to calmness, we also have a lot of programs. We run children's programs after school and summer programs for kids ages 5 to 12. We have a teen climate justice program for high school students. We run a community sport and agriculture. We have a big focus on food and agriculture, and we also distribute surplus food to people in need in the neighborhood, including prepared meals. We do about 2,000 meals a week right out of our kitchen. So there's a lot going on here. And again, thanks so much for coming, and I'm really looking forward with you to hear the panelists. Thank you.
Hi, many of you know I'm Elizabeth Goldstein. I'm the president of the Municipal Art Society, and welcome this evening. I'm joined by our partner, Frampton Tolbert.
Good evening. I'm Frampton Tolbert, the Executive Director of the Historic District Council, and Elizabeth and I are going to play a little bit of microphone tag. So a few notes tonight on how our event will go. This event will begin with a presentation by Aislinn Klein, MAS's Advocacy Associate. Then our 4 excellent panelists and I will take the stage, and we will join in conversation. Then we'll have some dedicated time for audience Q&A. When you arrive, you should have gotten index cards, and there'll be MAS staff members coming around to pick those up. But hopefully, we will also have some time at the end for additional Q&A.
Great, and we just want to add our enormous thanks to the 6th Avenue Community Center. Thank you so much, Howard, for having us. This is a great place, and we really appreciate your partnership here tonight. So I want to also say that we're really excited about being in a historic space this evening. This historic synagogue, as Howard indicated, has really been the heart of the Lower East Side for a long time, both in its role as a synagogue and then obviously now as the 6th Street Community Center. And it's really been working to empower the community through grassroots organizing since 1978. And we've heard a little bit about the incredible programming that they're doing here, so I hope you'll take an opportunity to come back. As you know, MAS has been around for a long time. We're celebrating our 130th anniversary this year, and our job in the world is lifting up the voices of people in the debates about the shape of New York City, its built environment, and leading the way towards a more livable city from sidewalk to skyline. We're really thrilled to be co-presenting this event with the Historic Districts Council and with the support of the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative. And I'll hand it over to Frampton to say a few words about HDC.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So for those of you who don't know, the Historic Districts Council is the citywide advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods. We work with more than 500 community organizations and partner with them to preserve their culturally, architecturally, and historically significant resources. And the issue of vulnerable buildings is one, or buildings at risk as we call them, has been a priority of HDC's for quite a while in light of increased demolitions over the past 18 months. HDC was pleased to submit an extensive set of policy recommendations to the LPC to help address some of these issues and continue to work with MAS our other preservation colleagues, and at the LBC on further recommendations and action. So a note about tonight's program. Tonight's program is really about landmark buildings that are threatening, at risk, or vulnerable. We could spend an entire program, obviously, or many more, discussing non-landmark historic buildings that are at risk. But tonight we really want to focus on those that are landmark, but still seen as at risk. Therefore, we're really excited to be presenting this event with MAS, which we started our collaboration on earlier this summer. And we wouldn't be here without Aislinn Klein, who created A Stitch in Time Saves Nine. I'll introduce Elizabeth, will introduce Aislinn.
We took dance lessons for this. Aislinn Klein, as Frampton indicated, is the advocacy associate at MAS. She published Stitch in Time Saves Nine as a project in April this year with the help of fellow staff members, some of whom are here tonight, Rana Zen, and I don't think Kate is here, no, but that was a team effort, and I'm sure she will acknowledge it as well. Prior to MAS, Aislinn worked in several bookstores and website and social media design and at the U.S. Census, but she was also doing work in land use and beginning to get her chops in that regard. She interned at the Department of City Planning and the City Council. She completed her master's in urban studies in 2022 from the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and for her undergraduate degree, Aislinn holds a bachelor's degree in geography from SUNY. I'd like to invite Aislinn to take it away.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. My name is Aislinn Klein. I'm the Advocacy Associate at the Municipal Art Society, and I'm very happy to have worked on A Stitch in Time Saves Nine. This was published on the MAS website in April of this year. I also wanted to give a special thanks to Spencer Williams, Stephen Albanese, Rhonda Silman, Cade Van Leeren, and Sean Kellier from MAS for their work on the research, mapping, and graphics of this project as well. Wouldn't be here without them, so thank you very much. So before I get into the project, first I want to also, of course, thank the 6th Street who oversaw over 50 contractors to restore this building as a community center. It's a fantastic example of adaptive reuse. The synagogue was built in around 1900, and on the left is a picture of the building when it was a synagogue around 1940. So many elements still remain, including congruent stains in marble on the walls in front that you'll see when you leave. And yeah, it's just a beautiful building, and it's the heart of our neighborhood. So moving on to the Stitch in Time project. This project began around December 2022 on 14 Bay Street, which is a building that was built in 1827 that stood within the Greenwich Village Historic District, therefore designated, was slated for demolition, and garnered significant media coverage. So in trying to understand what had happened at 14 Bay Street, we expanded this research to other recent cases of demolished designated structures. So the purpose of the project was to find out what exactly happened in recent preservation case studies where demolition occurred or where a structure was seriously at risk. So to do this, we chose 9 recent case studies over the past 3 years to explore these issues. And the phrase, "a stitch in time saves 9, is used to say that if you sort out a problem sooner, it may save a lot of extra work later. In this regard, we suggested policies to build upon landmark regulations to secure more protection or expand upon how the city can designate structures of historic and cultural significance. Our project was published in April 2023, about a week after LPC's announcement of the Vulnerable Historic Buildings Action Plan, which implements some of the solutions proposed by Preservation Act advocates, including MAS. So out of many examples, these case studies were chosen to showcase a range of preservation issues. Now, to be clear, these demolition and at-risk markers are what the case was when Stitch in Time was published in April, with at least one positive change to the list, which I'll get into later. They were also chosen for the project based on the strength of their example to the issue at hand. Some of these were not or are not designated landmarks, but have had significant community advocacy for designation, and we wanted to showcase this process. And for time's sake today, now, I've chosen to highlight only just 5 of these, but the full project is available online at the MAS website with much more detail into each case. So I'm going to start off with 441 Willoughby Avenue. This is in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. It's also known as the Dangler House. It was built around 1900. This was not a designated landmark, but had garnered strong advocacy for landmarking from neighborhood residents. So this building was sold to a developer, and a demolition permit was filed in early June 2022. A demolition permit has 40 days to stand before approved, and during this time, LPC had held 2 public hearings on the designation of the building. LPC did not vote on designation after the second hearing. They have a time limit of a year to vote on designation after a hearing. And the building was demolished in July 2022, based on that permit that was filed 40 days earlier. And the LPC chair stated that due to a technological glitch between DOB and LPC was not informed of the demolition permit to vote on designation in time. 14 Gay Street, as I mentioned earlier, built in 1827, was part of the Greenwich Village Historic District, had not only architectural but cultural significance. This building's owner had passed away with no will, so the city had to act as a steward and sold it to a new owner. The building was demolished in 2023 after the Department of Buildings determined structural instability due to illegal work in the basement, and there is now a large gap in the beautifully preserved winding streetscape that is more seen when you go in person. This is Astor Row, another beautifully preserved streetscape. This is West 130th Street in Harlem, built between 1880 and 1883. Astor Row consists of 28 near identical houses, which are all individual landmarks since 1981. Number 28 was in serious disrepair from as early as the 1980s when purchased by its last owner. After years of fines and lawsuits from the city, the building was demolished in 2021. These Gansevoort row houses were part of the Gansevoort Market Historic District. They were built in the 1840s on the edge of the meatpacking district. New construction of an office tower behind this property caused structural instability, and the DOB ordered a partial demolition, ordering the facade to be demolished, which was really nearly all of the buildings. The buildings are being rebuilt, but it will clearly never be quite the same. And I'm going to end now on one amazing positive success story, which is the former Public School number 4, which was landmarked in May of this year. This building was built in 1850 in Chelsea, Manhattan, and served African American school children and adults until 1894. So this designation was the result of immense years-long advocacy by historian Eric K. Washington, who was a recipient of HTC's Grassroots Awards this year. This building still has water damage and needs extensive repair work before any adaptive reuse can happen, but Mayor Eric Adams pledged $6 million in rehabilitation funds. So MAS is hopeful that the city's vulnerable historic buildings action plan will be successful in implementing reforms to preservation. In the meantime, our recommendations and suggestions reinforce and expand upon the new strategies announced by the city. Our suggestions include creating a landmarks at risk registry, as well as a citywide historic resources inventory, as has been done by the city of Los Angeles. An NYC property tax incentive for historic investment that currently exists at the state and federal levels. Addressing inequities in historic preservation with expanding financial and technical assistance to low-income homeowners, improving interagency communication between LPC and DOB, which was addressed in the Vulnerable Buildings Plan, and to fully fund and staff LPC and DOB, and 2 other policy suggestions. that would change the timeline of designations or demolitions to structures, which are to increase the time limit for LPC to review at-risk sites, and to pass a demolition review delay ordinance, which was proposed a few years ago by Councilmember Gail Brewer. And that is the end of my presentation. I am now very happy to welcome back Frampton Tolbert and pass off to our panelists, John Weiss, Valerie Jo Bradley, Andrea Goldwyn, and Edmund Meade.
I'm John Weiss. I'm Deputy Council of Landmarks, and my first job outside after college was actually working for the Municipal Arts Society. So I come full circle. First, I'd like to just say that at the Commission, we take protecting our landmarks very seriously. And when one comes down, it really is devastating to us as the city. That being said, I think it is important to understand that there are almost 38,000 landmarks in the city spread out through all 5 boroughs. And the buildings at risk, which we're very concerned about, is a very small subset of that almost 38,000 buildings. So most owners are taking care of their landmarks. I think it's also important to understand that every year we're saving landmarks that are at risk. And understandably, when a building comes down, there's a lot of press coverage, there's a lot of discussion, it's a very visible event. But at the same time, when landmarks are being saved that are at risk, but we work with the owners, DOD, the neighbors to save the building, there is almost no press coverage. So I do want people to understand it's not all always a situation where buildings come down. They are also being saved. So that being said, let me jump into our at-risk initiative. In 2021 and 2022, there was a cluster of 5 incidents where buildings, landmarks were either demolished or very seriously damaged. And because of that, the Commission took a hard look at what happened. Why did these buildings come down, and what can we do to prevent this from happening? We convened an expert roundtable of engineers, and Ed's firm had an engineer on that roundtable to discuss structural issues. We spoke with the other regulatory agencies around the country. What is Chicago doing? What is Boston doing? What's Philadelphia doing about this issue? And we talked, of course, to the preservationists and advocates in New York City. And from this, in our analysis, we've identified 3 causes for why those 5 incidents occurred. The first is demolition by neglect, which is something we've been dealing with for many years, as Frampton referred to. The second is hidden, unknown structural issues, which is what happened at 14th Street and 9th Avenue. There were really compromised buildings that people were not aware of until the sheetrock patch was taken off, and the engineers could see what's going on behind those finishes. And finally, in the case of 14 J Street, there was just blatantly illegal, negligent work by the contractor. So let me just jump into a little more about what we're doing about this. We've increased the engineering oversight that goes on with landmark buildings. We have the Department of Buildings now for the first time is auditing projects. We will flag a project when someone wants to do a lot of work on a landmark building. We think it might be an issue. We flag it to the Department of Buildings, and they will have engineers audit the project to make sure it's being done safely. We also have our own in-house engineer on retainer, a very qualified expert who we also refer applications to and do site visits where there's a possible negligence by neglect. So we're doing a lot more of this engineering perspective on this. We've also increased the information by sharing with DOD and that DOD is sharing with us. So in the past, we were getting some information from DOD, but for instance, we weren't told when a vacate order was issued by this current building. And that's a big red flag for us, to know that the DOD is thinking the building is unsafe, or the building next door is unsafe, that it has to be vacated. So now we're giving that information early on, so that we can reach out to the owners and get involved much earlier to deal with this situation. We also are working with our partners the community groups and the advocates to try to have more information going out to all of you. And some of those initiatives include, we will be mapping all of our violations, all the landmark violations throughout the city on a map that will be available on our website, most likely this fall, so that you all have access different addresses and see what's going on. We also will be sending out information on all of our violations to all the community boards. And if you haven't done that in the past, we would love community boards as representatives of the neighborhoods should be aware of the violations on the various buildings. So let me also sort of talk briefly about some of the case studies, because I think they're very illustrative of the situation. On 14 Day Street, the current owner who purchased the property, as was explained after the death of the prior owner, was told to make repairs to a foundation wall. That was an important addition. So he hired an engineer, he hired an architect, he got permits from DOB, he got permits from landmarks. And the permits were very clear that shoring and grazing had to be done in a certain manner, and that the foundation wall at issue had to be taken down in small 18-inch sections so that the building wouldn't be destabilized. In fact, what happened is, contrary to the approved plans, contrary to the permits, the contractor went in and took down the entire 25-foot foundation wall all at once, with woefully inadequate shoring and grazing in place. And not only did he do that, he also took down the foundation wall for the building next door for 16 Day Street. Now, fortunately, 16 Day Street was able to be stabilized and saved. It has a new foundation wall. But the Department of Buildings determined that 14 Day Street was just too dangerous because of this illegal work by the contractor to have workers in the basement trying to stabilize it. So it was taken down, unfortunately. It's important to understand, under the landmarks law, when the Department of Buildings determines a building is unsafe and it's a threat to public safety, the landmarks review is preempted. So once there is an order that a building is unsafe, landmark staff, we certainly talk with the Department of Building engineers, we meet with them, we talk to the owners, we talk to the engineers, but legally we can't say stop this. We are overridden because of the importance of public safety. And it's not just a theoretical concern about public safety. There was a landmark building on Norfolk Street a few years ago, which was being demolished by hand, so we see how much of it can be saved. And unfortunately, one of the walls came down and killed the construction worker. So that is really a very strong concern on the part of DOB in landmarks. Now, after Row, another one of the case studies, is a good illustration of the demolition by neglect cases. In that case, the owner, who was not a developer, but a woman who owned the building for probably 35 years, we spent 10 years trying to get her to make repairs. The first 4 years, we tried to have her do it voluntarily, and she would file for permits, she hired some engineers and so forth, but it never did any work. So we then sued her in court, and for 6 years, we were in court with her, and we had judges order her 3 times to make repairs. So there were 3 court orders from judges ordering her to make repairs. She still did not make repairs, she did not sell the building, she was held in contempt of court, and she still did not make repairs. Eventually, the Department of Buildings did determine the building was too far gone and was taken down. But in that case, obviously, we spent 10 years trying to get the owner to either sell it or make repairs. And then finally, on the case of 14th Street and 9th Avenue, in that case, a permit was issued for extensive work at the building. And when the contractors started taking away the sheetrock and the partition walls and plaster work, they uncovered there were pre-existing conditions. So it actually was the new construction work actually didn't cause the building to be unsafe. It was these hidden conditions, which we believe were there for many years. The facades had pulled away from the party walls, and also over many years there were many alterations to the buildings. So party walls had openings cut in, the building joined. And so between these sort of hidden conditions people were unaware of, and all these alterations, DOB did determine the building was unsafe and had the facade taken down. Now, the only good news for this is the owners were able to salvage about 40 or 50% of the brick in the ground floor was saved. And right now, they're in the process of actually reconstructing the facade. And I was on site a few weeks ago, and it does look pretty good. So that hopefully will be at least a somewhat of a positive outcome of a very unfortunate situation. So just to sum up, we have these 4 focuses of the activist conditioner: to have enhanced engineering to protect the buildings, to have better communication with acquired buildings, like giving vacate orders and other information from DOB earlier on. We're working with the communities to sort of push out more information, to work with the community groups, the neighbors, advocacy organizations on this. And also just, I think, to be involved earlier on with trying to identify these buildings and monitor them. So everything happens sooner rather than later. That's my quick overview of the activist initiative in these cases.
Thank you. Ed?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Ed Meade. I'm a principal and a structural engineer at Silman, probably Silman Associates, headquartered here in New York. And I've been with the firm for more than 34 years, so it's been a while. And I joke I started out with a full head of hair. I'd like to say tonight that I'm bringing the perspective of an engineer to the table. When everyone says resources and preserve, there are lots of other aspects: conservation, historical integrity, the actual preservation of fabric. And the structural engineer at the table today is really concerned about making sure the building stands up. And I just say that's my professional responsibility, it's our professional responsibility. So we, as structural engineers, really do respect and support the idea that the Department of Buildings has to protect public safety, and that's either safety of individuals working in the building or neighbors and stuff like that. My advocacy as a preservationist is we can save almost any building if you know enough information about it at the beginning, which, to your point, Don, if you don't know the information, you may not be able to save it, and or if there are enough resources put to the building. And I like Aislenn's report, really just summarizing what the options are. And I think every one of these has a lot of value and should overall be implemented as soon as possible. My concern is that some of these buildings might be public. If it's public, the city may have a little bit more control on advocacy within the city government to get stuff done. If it's a private building, it's private property, so you have to get permission or an order to get into the building, to work on the building, if the city is going to take control. And what I'd like to see, if there would be a combination of carrot and stick approach to encourage property owners to report findings to the Department of Buildings, and in fact, maybe with, as you said, John, with the enhanced program, an advocacy to make sure the information is shared between the owner and the Department of Buildings, to the effect of really with the DOB team and qualified engineers working for the owner, making sure that they really do check the building. They look at it with probes, they do non-destructive testing, they open it up, they look at things and they review them carefully together. It does require experienced staff on the DOB part, and it requires experienced engineers to do it on the private ownership standpoint. So that's my main advocacy for tonight. Obviously, you have to cross that bridge to get to that amount of nirvana or idyllic spot. But I think if we have the information and we have more resources and attention to these types of issues, which I hear John, is starting, I would say that we're heading down the right path. I'd also recognize that Joe Tortorella, our former president, and Nancy Hudson, one of my business partners, one of our principals, were working at strongly within that previous team that you mentioned that was convened between DOB and private industry. So they can speak even more at some later date if we wish. But it's really the idea of protecting public safety and protecting the safety of people in the building. And I know it's terrible when we lose a building, however it happens, but it's also terrible if we lose a life. So I think that's really something we have to be really careful about. I've been on buildings where we weren't even working on the building and the building got hit by lightning. and literally a part of the building got shattered, and a person on the street got killed in a terrible storm. It happened about 5 or 6 years ago. So we're trying to help save the building, to make it safe, but it's really to make it safe is for better for worse the first priority. So that's kind of me as succinct in a nutshell. Thank you.
Andrea?
Hi, I'm Andrea Goldwyn. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the New York Landmarks Conservancy. The Conservancy is a private, nonprofit, citywide preservation group. We are in our 50th anniversary year. Like many others, we spun off from MAS. And our emphasis is not only the advocacy work that I'm involved with, but providing financial and technical assistance to building owners across the city. We have loan programs and grant programs. We actually provided, I think, 2 grants to this property for work on, thank you, I appreciate that, for work on the entrance and for some restoration after Hurricane Sandy. And we were very involved in Astor Row, and so we really see that as a very, very unfortunate situation, but my coworkers got to know many of the owners on that block, and Roberta Washington, architect for Astor Row, among other things. And I can say, kind of to John's point, many of the buildings were restored. We do have to deal with a terrible situation there. And just going back, I actually wrote my graduate school thesis on demolition by neglect. And even back then, it was sort of a combination of what do you do with the building and how does the owner undertake this project that they have committed themselves to. And I think Astor Row is a great example of that, where in many of the cases along that street, they did come out successfully. Certainly in this one they didn't, and that kind of leads to my point is, what do we do next? In a situation like Astor Row, in places where these buildings have been lost, how do we move forward and ensure that the cohesiveness of the historic district is maintained? Because that's so important for the district. I think in some of the buildings, like the one John's talking about at 14th and 9th, it sounds like it could have a good result. We've actually given preservation awards to buildings that have been reconstructed, and they're done really well. It requires a lot of work with LPC, with John's office and his colleagues. In a situation like Astor Row, where the buildings are so unique, it's a little hard to say how that's going to turn out, but with LPC's oversight, I think that's our best chance for a good result. And then bringing it to all of you, making sure that your interest and your advocacy elevates preservation, and that you are bringing it to your elected officials, because we can do everything, but for getting the resources, for getting the interagency collaboration that we need, we also need the political support. And so it's really important that you go back and talk to your elected officials and make sure that they understand that preservation is important to you and to your community.
And I'd like to turn it over to Valerie Jo Bradley.
Hello, everyone. I am co-founder and president of Harlem Now, which is a historic preservation organization committed to saving historic districts and historic buildings in Harlem, and that's not an easy task. Because, Harlem has suffered, I think, in general, benign neglect from government and individuals, and the misunderstanding about what preservation is. So we have, I have just spent almost a week trying to save 66, 68 West 119th Street, after having a very successful program of laying a marker in front of the building where the 1963 March on Washington was planned. The very next day, we started working on trying to save 6668 West 119th Street, which is in the Mount Morris Park Historic District. It has now been torn down. And my question is to John, under the new protocol, the LPC engineer is supposed to also go into the building in addition to the buildings department to look at the building, but it's my understanding that the LPC engineer did not go in that building, and it's two buildings. Am I wrong or right?
Well, that's not exactly the protocol, quite frankly. I can't speak about the details of 66 and 68, 119th Street, because it's under the lawsuit against the city. So I was actually told that a lot of parts not go into any details. But in general, and we've all spoken about this situation last week before the lawsuit was filed. But to your question, no, we don't always have the LPC engineer go into a building that's at risk. And quite frankly, even we did, as I mentioned, living in DOE overrides us. So we can have our engineer go in and say, building can be saved, and DOE is the agency that is destined to power to say, it has to come down and say.
Now, that sounds like some legislation that we need to draft. But anyway, I'm very upset because I did all the right things. I got my state senator, she was working on this with me the whole week. And finally it got down to, I said, just see if they have saved the facade. And so she went back to see if the facade could be saved. The facade could have been saved, but it would take a lot more money than just knocking it down. And so the question becomes, is it worth it in a historic district to save a facade to keep the integrity of a neighborhood or worry about money? And that's the dilemma we have. Now, with regard to benign neglect, I have made some suggestions, and I would like to move on making it a reality. I think most of you know that when an occupied building is neglected by an owner, the city steps in and takes it. Or they don't take it, but they assign a 7A administrator who then is responsible for addressing the maintenance requirements for the building, and then the owner has to pay for that. Why can't we have something similar for vacant buildings? When it's clear after decades that an owner is not going to do the right thing, that the city appoint a 7A administrator while you can still get in the building and it's not ready to fall down, and address the maintenance issues. I am now working with some members of the city council as well as some members of the state senate to try to see if we can get that legislation enacted, because I understand the state is also involved in that. So that's one remedy we could deal with. Another one is, I'd like to ask, when is it ever when you realize that an owner, no matter how many penalties you give them, how many warnings or whatever, they're just not gonna do it? And what is the responsibility of the city and city agencies to address that so that we don't lose the building? It's privately owned, but it's clear that the owner is just not going to do it for whatever reason. There's a responsibility, I believe, on government to step in and do something about that when it's just blatant neglect. And we have to look at that. I'm willing to work with groups to look at that, because that's a serious problem. I guess we've lost a number of buildings. We talk about Astor Road, we talk about, what about St. Nick's Club? There was a fireman, the fireman died, so they took the building down. So does it mean that when someone dies because of a building, then you take the building down? I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious here, but I just wonder, because many people say that that building was not that bad off that it hadn't been taken down. Especially Gail Brewer, who was then the Manhattan Borough President. She was shocked that it was taken down. We didn't even have an opportunity to even address that issue. That's a great, great loss to St. Nick's Club. It's a great loss to Harlem. It's a great loss to jazz music. We don't have anything that can fill that void right now. We also have, we lost a building on, in December on Malcolm X Boulevard or Lenox Avenue. We happened to be having a meeting across the street and saw them erecting a shed to take the building down. And it was when advocates like Landmarks Conservancy and HDC, Save Harlem Now, and the Village, we all got together and started demonstrating that the city then took this issue very seriously. I don't think if we had yelled about it and brought out media to talk about it, that it might not have been addressed as quickly as it has been. And that being said, I really thank the city for what it has done, but I think more can be done. For example, not just relying on the buildings department saying that the building has to come down, but relying also on the engineer that you have hired to look at these things, to get an opinion from that engineer too. I think that's very important because that engineer would be looking at it from another perspective as needed. And we need that, and we need that kind of commitment. And it can't be arbitrary. It's gotta be always happen. If a building has been identified, LPC should be there looking at it too.
All right, let me, oh, fantastic. Can I ask of the others on the panel to speak to some of Valerie's comments on, besides the vulnerable building plan, what else do you think the city should be doing, both DOB or LPC? This 7-day administrator, what are some of the other possibilities? I know in the NAS presentation, a database of neglected buildings was a recommendation, so I'd love to hear from, especially from Andrea and Ed. Are there other things you think have not been implemented yet that should be worked on either as legislation or policies?
Sure, I think what's frustrating is that a lot of the tools exist, they're just not used quickly enough, they're not used appropriately enough. I think the example Valerie's talking about on 119th Street, there were neighbors calling DOB and submitting complaints about
13 years.
for over a decade about the condition of the building, and DOB, when I was looking at the records, the notes just said that the building was vacant and sealed, and I don't know if that tells the whole story, but that's what they're saying. DOB just didn't do anything. And it's really, I think it's imperative that we get our elected officials to really push these agencies, to push City Hall, to use the tools that they do have. I think, I love the idea of more financial incentives. I think Valerie's idea about how to address vacant buildings is great. All of those things are going to take a long time to accomplish, but the existing tools really need to be implemented implemented in a much more serious way. So I think that's kind of, what our starting point has to be.
So I just would add maybe three things. I like Valerie's idea that there be an independent review of the building by an LPC chartered engineer, structural engineer. I feel that that's a good high standard of care, and usually they'll have two engineers, one for DOB, one for LPC, who may, disagree or come to a conclusion that's somewhere in between, maybe not absolutely save 100% or just demolish it, but some way to figure out how to do it. I would say the other issue really comes down to money, and it's money for the survey, the examination, getting into the building and studying the building. So I know who the engineer is, I think very highly of the engineer who worked for LPC, but he and his firm, his business partners, and others, if it's not just his firm, would actually have to get paid to do that. And there could literally be 1,000 buildings out there to do this, for him or her to do that. So it's a lot of resources that need to be directed that are not currently, as far as I know, available to LPC to do that. And then the other thing is really this idea of information flow, which refers back and forth. But I'm a little bit torn about, to your point, Andrew, we have the DOB system, we have DOB Now, we have notifications, we have facade inspections, we have other inspections that have to be done. I guess the one thing I don't want us to lose, whatever the word is, perspective on is maybe there's 1 million buildings in the city, actually a little bit more. What do we say, there's 85,000 who are individual landmark buildings. 38,000. So 38,000 is a lot, but that means we've got 960,000 buildings that are not landmark that we also have to be responsible for. So what it really sounds like is we've got to put more resources into examining all these existing buildings. There's not just the 38,000 that are significant. I, as preservationists, think that they are very important, but maybe to your point, Valerie, that there's benign and neglected a lot of contributing buildings as well in Harlem and every other community in the city that need to be preserved. Even some of the buildings we saw here that are not or were not designated landmarks, they needed really someone to go into them. It's not just a report saying it's closed, it's empty, it's tight, physically going into these buildings, but that is a massive undertaking. And even if it's quote unquote only 1%, 10,000 buildings, that's a lot of buildings to look at. So we've gotten our, we'll call it ducks in a row with facade inspections and other types of safety, but now we're talking about getting into buildings. I'm not quite sure if the enabling legislation actually permits the DOB or LPC without reasonable suspicion of a problem. Like, you can't just go into any building that you want to.
We can't go to any building.
Right.
We can't trespass.
Well, you can't trespass. I think if DOB saw an urgent safety condition, they have the right to potentially investigate. So I'm only pointing out that you don't have that enabling part of the legislation to allow you, meaning LPC, to go into the building. So I think that's another issue. How can we get them some of that authority to get into the building?
If I can follow up to those points, we actually do, for exactly that reason, we do joint inspections with DOB engineers and inspectors. We can't get access legally, they can. So we'll work with DOB and they'll go with us and can get into a building when we can. And I think it's also important to understand DOB does agree to have some buildings safe. There's a case, 222 Brooklyn Avenue, which had a devastating fire. It's a fascinating history in that building. And I was on scene with DOB and the owner's engineers the day, hours after the fire. And at first, the entire building was going to come down. It's a corner building in the historic district. But as the day went on, the DOB engineer pulled back and they kept the street facade and half of the side facade. So a significant amount of that building was saved because the DOB engineer was convinced that it was safe and the owner's engineer could stabilize it. And then also to follow up on a point Valerie made about the financial penalties are not enough sometimes. We had a case in Brooklyn, we sued an owner over 10 years ago. He was ordered to repair 2 buildings on his lot. He did not. So the judge ordered him to pay $1,000 a week until repairs are made for these 2 buildings. He still has not made the repairs. That was 9 years ago. And he's continuing to pay $1,000 a week at this point. He's also been fined $150,000. So I think the total is over $600,000 he's paid in penalties, and the work is still not done. So you're absolutely right, the money alone doesn't do it. We can ask the judge actually to put him in jail on weekends, to find him in contempt, and she did not want to do that. So we can ask to have him in jail on the weekend.
Does anybody else on the panel, I mean, I do think it's important to talk about the balance of incentives for property owners versus the penalties, increased penalties. I'd love to hear if Ed or Andrea or Val have any comments on if you think there should be stricter penalties or incentives.
Obviously, penalties don't work. That's my position. So, I think we have to come up with something else because penalties don't work.
I was gonna say, I think it's a little extreme, Howard, because we had a case of Windermere, which is the individual landmark at 57th Street. It was owned by a Japanese corporation. We sued them, and the judge imposed a $1.2 million fine on the owner. And luckily, the owner, who was in Japan, very stubborn, he had a son who was a dentist in New Jersey. And the son convinced the father, saying, you're not going to, we're going to pay $1.2 million, just sell the building. So in that case, the large fine didn't get the owner to sell the building, and the new owner has, the past decade, been slowly restoring the building, and actually looks fantastic at this point. But in that case, the large fine didn't help us.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think that, to Valerie's point, the penalties don't always get the outcome that we're looking for, but I think we need to keep the penalty structure in place and maybe even enhance it so that it creates an atmosphere where maybe people think twice. Now, obviously, to John's terrible example of this guy who was willing to lose all of his money to not do work on his building. I think at some point, maybe there's not a whole lot that can be done with that owner. Maybe there can be, some incentive to try to get him to sell the building. The Conservancy does have financial assistance programs, not at that level. We have loan programs for mostly for homeowners, small single-family buildings, small co-ops. We have grant programs for nonprofits. But you also have to have, an owner who is a partner who is willing to do the work that needs to be done. And I think at some point you're going to run into situations where the penalties, the sticks might do a little better than the carrots. We also, just to remind everyone, have a great state tax credit program. New York is very fortunate, not all states have that, and that's been able to help a lot of building owners do work. So the incentives are not as plentiful as we might like, but they are there for people who are looking for them. But sometimes you do run into kind of a brick wall of a person, and then maybe you want to keep the penalties in your back pocket, just in case.
Ed, you want to?
Yeah, I was going to add to that, that there's maybe a special case, but a big case, and I think this is a segue to a later discussion, that owners don't always have the means, the knowledge, or the expertise to be able to do an investigation. And that might be a not-for-profit group, it might be a small private owner, it might be another religious institution. And I would advocate that perhaps besides New York Farmers Conservancy and other allied groups, there might be a fund established specifically for landmark buildings, not for every single building out there, that might provide for an initial assessment of a vulnerable building. In other words, if you've got your database, you've got 1 million, you've got 38,000, you've got the top 400, and you say these are the 400 that clearly they don't have transfer of air rights, they're not gonna get $500,000 of money from that or other sources. So what are the vulnerable buildings out there, identify them, and then figure out what's the funding stream to pay for those initial assessments of the buildings. Help, at least to try to identify how bad or good are they before something really goes bad.
I'm gonna ask one more question, but I'm also gonna, panelists can also make a kind of summary remarks if they want to, and then we will open the floor to the audience. But I did want to say, given our audience here, what do you all see as the role of communities? How can community members be more involved in the process? A lot of these are all privately owned buildings, so you can't just go in and save it yourself. So how can community members be involved in our own communities at a more involved rate to help save some of these buildings? And how, whether elected officials, community boards, or just a regular community member. I'll start off with that.
Well, I think it's important that community be involved, and I think in the case of 66 and 68, the community was involved. And they still are involved. While I'm sitting at the US Open last night, one of them sent me a long text, telling me that the owner of the buildings that guys in court is now eyeing another building on Mount Morris Park West and asking me, do you remember who the owner is? And I do remember who the owner is. He said, well, we can't let him buy that building. I mean, that's the level of community. And I like to see that kind of involvement because the guy said, he ended it by saying, this building is too beautiful to be demolished. And that's the bottom line, that community cares enough about what's happening in their community, and they don't want to see these treasures taken down because they'll never really be replaced with the same kind of structure. Even if it's to LPC specifications, it still won't be the historic structure that it was. So the only thing I would say is the government has to listen to the community. Like those people wrote letters for 13 years talking about those two buildings and nothing was done. We have to, if we're gonna ask the community to be involved, you gotta listen to them.
Great, thanks, Val. And just to kind of jump off on that, I think it's also important for community members to follow these projects through. The situation on 119th Street, that owner at some point is going to go back to LPC for a new building on the property. And when you look at that block and think about why it was designated, look at the architecture, look at what a beautiful block it is, what a cohesive block it is. I think it's going to be, unfortunately, up to the community to make sure that LPC hears that that's what people want to see on that block again. And Valerie's right. I mean, that's lost. A brick building, maybe they could have, saved some of the bricks. Brownstones, they probably should have found a way to save the facade, but that ship has sailed. But to make sure that what goes back there is in keeping with the historic district, community is going to have to play a really big role in that and hold the commissioner's feet to the fire.
I agree with that, Andrew. The commissioners listen very carefully to testimony. I've seen them again and again be swayed by the public testimony from the neighbors and other people who are expressing their concern about building. So when there is a public hearing about either Gaston Road or the site on 119th Street, people should come down and testify. And one other point, neighbors also are a great resource in terms of helping us find owners. Because that's another problem we have is if we find out a building's at risk, we can't find the owner. They disappear. And a lot of times the neighbors, if it's a long-term neighbor, they'll know a relative or they'll know who the person is. So that can be a great resource for us to help us try to save the building.
So I'd like to end with a quote, but the preface is the idea of citizen powerful actions, whether it's civil rights, protecting buildings. I'm passionate about New York City. Whether you're talking about Jane Jacobs, Martin Luther King Jr., the idea of direct action, people leading and doing an individual and a group effort. But I like to end with a quote, and I did look it up, so I'm reading it from my phone, but I've read it for about 10 years, which is from Margaret Meade, the anthropologist, where she says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever happens." So I just think that's really true for everyone, for individuals and neighborhood groups, to citizens, to the wider city. Thank you.
Thank you all, our panelists. I think we do have time for a few questions. Elizabeth, let me know how many you do have time for. The first question here is, do you think the city should require certification of a preservation architect and engineer, and possibly even a contractor, to ensure that a contextual assessment and is really done for buildings at risk, and work on buildings at risk?
Yes. I think, when LPC is involved, when they have the engineers who they're working with, they are certified. I think maybe the question also, just to branch out a little, when architects and engineers and contractors are working on designated buildings, do they need to be certified? I think that's kind of a broader discussion, and some criteria would be good. And the Conservancy does have referrals available, but that's not a universal solution. So I think education for architects and engineers and contractors who work on historic buildings is maybe a very doable step.
I'm a lawyer, so I'm a complicated answer to this question. And I think Andrea is spot on when she says education is important. And I think we're really working with some of the professional groups to have more education. But while of course we want qualified people working on landmark buildings, sometimes we just need the contractor to follow the permit, to follow the plans, to just do common sense. Because I think 14 Day Street, if any one of you worked in that basement and saw the shoring bracing and what the contractor was doing, all of you would have said, this is wrong. So we just need contractors who just follow permits and follow plans. I also think sometimes there might be an equity issue, because if you have more credentials required of contractors or architects or engineers, they will then charge more. And so some owners will say, I can't afford to do this, the work is being done. And then there might be an equity issue where the wealthy owners can get the work done, and the owners who aren't so wealthy, maybe they can't get the work done. So I think actually it's a nuanced question that has to be really explored carefully.
I could go on for a long time on this one question. I'll just say that I think it's a very complicated question, does not have a one word or one sentence answer, and I think that would be a really best thing to do is the combination of the design professionals, the registered architects, and the licensed professional engineers who work collaboratively with LPC, with DOB, and with the preservation community to decide how to work that out, because it's pretty complicated and it has a lot of, to your point, legal around occasions. I don't want it to become like exclusive or the rich people can do it, etc. But also, if you look at how long it took to develop facade inspection criteria, protocols, and legislation, it will take some time to get to that point. I really think that it should start within the design professionals in concert with the DOB and the thank you.
This question, putting violations online is good, but most violations don't affect the structural integrity of the building. Why not put a list of at-risk why not publish a list of at-risk buildings at regular intervals? That way the community could get involved more earlier in the process. Definition of at-risk to be determined, and perhaps levels of risk for certain buildings should be identified so the public understands how at risk this building is.
Well, I can answer that. We are doing that, we will be doing that somewhat, because when we put online our map of violations, that will include the violations we issue for failure to maintain a landmark building, and also when we take a step back, our commissioner issue an order to an owner to chair's order to make repairs, which usually indicates a lawsuit is going to happen down the road. So that kind of information would be made available to the public.
Anybody else want
I would just ask, but not require an answer, is what do you do about buildings that you don't know or you can't get into? It's not an easy answer. I'm not expecting you to answer unless Andrew wants to.
No answer to that. I just hope that that includes different kinds of owners, private owners, and public owners.
Sometimes the city itself undertakes the demolition. I believe that was the case at Astor Road. And the OPC required that city funds be used for stabilization instead. DOB orders generally require the building be made safe, not necessarily demolished.
I like that suggestion. I mean, you know, it might even be cheaper to save it than to demolish it. And that's being proactive.
DOB has done that on occasion. There was a building in Convent Avenue which was stabilized by the city. And I think the outcome of that was very unfortunate. The owner ended up not making any permanent repairs. It was involved in litigation, so it wasn't sold for a year. And eventually, 5 years later, the city came back and took down the building. So even though the city had spent money stabilizing it, it remained vacant, remained dangerous, and ultimately it did come down. There was another case in Brooklyn where repairs were made, the building was sold, and that building was saved. But again, I think that's an issue that DOB has to determine whether it's so far gone, so dangerous, they really feel the timing of it is the building needs to come down now, and they can't wait to stabilize it. I think that's what happened with 119th Street. There's no time to take steps to stabilize it.
Well, the owner said we could stabilize it. And there was some question about whether we had the capacity to do that.
I know that.
This will actually be our last question. It's a little tangential, but interested to hear your thoughts. Can you please talk about this work where landmark buildings are demolished and become vacant lots for decades, leaving holes in communities? How can community organizations and civics and officials, possibly like the Commissioner of the Public Realm, help prevent the situation?
Well, the question is, does the owner still own the land? And if the owner still owns the land, I don't think that government can do much, right?
That's good. We can't compel someone to build a building. We can't force them to do that.
All right, well, with that, I want to thank everyone here for coming tonight. Really appreciate it, and I will turn it over, and obviously thank all our wonderful panelists who will be sticking around. If we have more questions for them, and I will turn it over to Elizabeth for some brief closing remarks.
Well, these are going to be very brief, but I wanted to thank everybody for coming and sharing your thoughts, and all of you for coming, and also for the 6th Street Community Center for having us. It is very clear, as Frampton said at the beginning of this conversation, that this is a many layered conversation that we need to be having much more extensively. And so I really appreciate all of you coming out and joining us this evening to begin or continue, perhaps I should say, this extremely important question about the vulnerable buildings in New York City. I also want to thank the MAS staff and also the 6th Street Community Center for all the work that they did to pull this event together. Please help me thank them as you go out. And I also want to say that there's some food and drink out there that I hope you'll partake in. And we can have some more informal conversations